I realise I'm somewhat late to the party with this, but we do need to talk about Neon Genesis Evangelion. I first discovered Neon Genesis Evangelion during COVID. Stuck in my bedroom for 2 weeks, I stumbled on an unassuming mecha anime on Netflix. But what began as a classic 90s anime with giant fighting robots slowly swallowed me. At first with its subtle biblical imagery, and then its not so subtle biblical imagery, but inevitably with its paralyzing psycho-spiritual diagnosis of the human condition. Now, it's been 3 years since then, but Neon Genesis has many alternate endings, and it's carved for itself a corner of my brain. And in this video, I want to talk about why. The plot of Evangelion is distorted by two things that make it as brilliant as it is confusing. First, the way the story tells itself through increasingly unsettling religious imagery that can alienate the viewer, especially if they're not intimately familiar with the many niche symbols that the story is told through. And second, the way that it fractures that story across 3 endings with no explicit or clear answer as to how these endings relate to each other, if at all. I want to make sense of both of these puzzles in this video. I'm going to give a substantive breakdown of the religious imagery as we go, but before we really get started, it's going to be prudent to address the problem of Neon Genesis's multiple endings first, as a matter of methodology. Interestingly, I think the solution to the problem of multiple endings might be derived in the Judeo-Christian framework that Neon Genesis leverages so aggressively. The first biblical reference of the whole story is in its very title, Neon Genesis Evangelion. It quite literally means new beginning gospel. Now consider for a moment the canonical gospels of the Bible, even the apocryphal gospels like Thomas, Philip, and Judas. Each of these tells a story of Jesus, but they're not quite identical. They remain distinct from each other. However, stand far enough away to see the big picture, see how these stories weave together common threads. And it's obvious that despite the variations, they all communicate the same revelation of Jesus. And though inspired by some divine hand, I don't think it's controversial to say that the quote-unquote Word of God was penned by human beings. And accordingly, their approximations of a revelation so divine that it cannot be entirely captured or reduced to text. Now, I think the title of Neon Genesis Evangelion invites us to understand its story in the same way, as a form of gospel, that is, as fractured approximations of a single story, where the varied changes are incidental to a more fundamental story about the human condition, which I hope to articulate is vastly consistent between each ending. So essentially, instead of debating which ending is the true one or whether they are sequential, it might be prudent instead to take these endings in parallel, as companion pieces, each telling the same basic story best read in totality. So let's pull on these tangled threads chronologically. I'm going to split the story into 3 chapters. We've got BSI, before the second impact, ASI, after the second impact, and eventually AHI, after human instrumentality. Chapter 1, before the second impact. What happens? At some point before the spark of life is kindled on a primordial earth, 2 beings arrive to terraform the world. The first is Adam, also called the first angel. Adam arrives on the white moon, which becomes the Antarctic continent. Now the second is Lilith, also called the second angel, who arrives on the black moon that buries itself deep in the earth under modern-day Japan, whose arrival causes the first impact, cataclysmically launching debris into space that would later form Earth's natural moon. Despite being called angels, Adam and Lilith are to be distinguished from all of the angels our beloved characters will go on to battle in their Evangelion units million years later. And this is because Adam and Lilith are seeds of life, that is to say, they are beings of procreation, characterized by their ability, possibly even their purpose, to populate Earth with life. Making sense of the BSI prologue. There's a lot to unpack in this prologue to Neon Genesis Evangelion, and we can begin by accounting for the rich religious imagery that sets the stage for the entire story to follow. We can start by seeing the prologue as a Genesis story, a Neon Genesis, a new Genesis. We have Adam and Lilith, who are analogues for the biblical characters of Adam and Eve. We have an Eden of sorts, which is simply Earth before the second impact, a quasi-paradise without the terror of angels, where humanity lives in relative peace. And finally, we have the original sin, so to speak, of humanity, an attempt to take that which does not belong to them, to merge their own DNA with Adam's. Now, in the Genesis of the Bible, God creates man in his image, but in Neon Genesis, there's an attempt to quite literally invert the biblical story of Genesis by creating God in the image of man. Now, Genesis of the Bible is the quintessential archetype of human arrogance, but it's also a story that honors and acknowledges our wonderful aptitude for desire, for discovery, for consciousness itself. Humanity is not just another animal in the garden. It has agency, it has a will of its own. Biblical Genesis does put an ugly mirror up to that, to show us how those very same capacities that distinguish us, that define our humanity, that validate our very existence, these same gifts, if left unchecked, pave the way to arrogant pain and suffering. But Neon Genesis Evangelion, in its prologue alone, outdoes the Bible's Genesis. In Neon Genesis, humanity doesn't just try to become like God. Indeed, they try to create a new God in their own image. And in doing so, humanity indulges a twisted type of narcissism to paint God with its own face. It elevates the dangerous curiosity of the Bible's Genesis to a Machiavellian conspiracy to beat God at his own game. Naturally, Neon Genesis punishes humanity in equal proportion to its hubris. Humanity fails to create anything at all except an apocalyptic event that forever dooms humanity to fight for their survival, existentially threatened by both Adam's advancing angels and the treachery of humanity's fellow man. Pandora's box is opened, and just as in the Bible's Genesis, the paradise of the New Age is lost again to the arrogance of humanity. This Neon Genesis is colored with even more pessimism, with the substitution of Eve for Lilith. So who's this mysterious imposter in the Genesis story? Well, Lilith exists in a warped fusion of Jewish folklore and ancient mythology. And there are two defining things that we need to know about her from these old stories. For one, she's older than Eve, made at the same time as Adam from the same clay. She's Adam's first wife. In these stories, there's only ever a need to create Eve because Lilith proves an insufficient companion to Adam. And the second thing we need to know is that she is insufficient because she's something of a demonic, morally corrupt being driven by base and hedonistic desire. Now, it's not by accident that the seed of humanity is named after this mythical, morally corrupt being. The gift of knowledge comes with the curse of consciousness, of suffering a subjective experience amongst other conscious beings, and this will torture our characters for the duration of the story. Each turns to their own avenue of quote-unquote sin or hedonism to deal with or rather forget their human condition. And it is fitting then that the mother of humanity is mythologically smeared with that same hedonistic sin. So if that's Lilith, where is the biblical character of Eve manifest in the story? Well, I think Eve manifests in the Ava units. Eve was created from a rib of Adam, and like her, the Ava units, save Unit 1, are carved from Adam himself. The Ava units manifest the pinnacle of human engineering, to imprison the power of a god and manipulate it for human purposes. It is the ultimate symbol of power of human knowledge. That same knowledge that biblical Eve cannibalizes in the story of Genesis when she eats from the forbidden fruit. It is both thrilling and terrifying. It's liberating but humiliating. And the curse of the Avas will claw away at our cast of pilots before long. Finally, we have to deal with Adam. Adam is somewhat sacrificed for the benefit of humanity. He suffers a quasi-Christ-like humiliation as this being of uncontainable power of life itself is emasculated deep beneath the ice of the Antarctic. And the spear that holds him, the spear of Longinus, is fittingly named after the spear that pierces the side of Christ during the crucifixion. The relationship between this sacrifice and humanity is difficult to make sense of, but we will examine it more closely when we look at Adam in his form of Karu Nagisa later on. Overall, the Before the Second Impact prologue shrouds humanity in a blanket of pessimism. It paints our defining ability to think our way through survival in shame and hubris. But here's the most damning part of all this. It's to remember that Lilith and Adam, they never really spoke to humanity. That is to say that no one told humanity to interpret and understand these alien beings through a Judeo-Christian framework, let alone a very pessimistic one. It was humanity and humanity alone who chose to name their mother, Lilith, with all the shameful connotations that come with that name. It was humanity and humanity alone who interpreted the physiological distinctions between their DNA and Adam's in biblical terms. All in all, the pessimism that stains the Neon Genesis prologue is one that is entirely self-imposed, exposing the ultimate precondition for the Neon Genesis Evangelion story, a fundamental disgust for the human condition. More than any of the intricate symbology, more than any of the rich backstories of our characters, it is this inherent shame for being alive that kicks off and sustains the story that follows, and characterizes the greatest villain of all of Neon Genesis Evangelion, humanity itself. And so we've set the stage for the story, a stage rotten with nihilism, but one where the arrogant ambition of humanity will offer it a false prophet, preaching a new revelation he calls human instrumentality. Chapter 2, After the Second Impact. In the years that follow the Second Impact, an organization named Nerve emerges to cover up the circumstances of the cataclysm. Nerve nurtures and sustains the convenient lie that the Second Impact was caused by a freak asteroid that struck the Antarctic. Nerve is indeed a shadow organization for an international cabal called Zila, who are essentially like the Illuminati, or if you are one of the initiated, the Lali Lule Lo. Lali Lule Lo. Now, Zila are in possession of what they call the Dead Sea Scrolls, which prophesize humanity's evolution to godhood. They refer to this prophecy as their quote-unquote scenario, and the ascension into godhood as the Human Instrumentality Project. It was Zila who knowingly drove the experiments with Adam behind the scenes to purposefully produce the Second Impact, or to begin the domino effect of fate laid out in their Dead Sea Scrolls that they believe culminate in humanity's godhood. Now, Zili groom a young and ambitious scientist by the name of Gendo to head the development of Nerve. Anticipating the onslaught of Adam's angels as a result of freeing him in the Antarctic, Zila charges Nerve with the duty of protecting humanity until the Human Instrumentality Project is ready to commence, as dictated by their scenario in the Dead Sea Scrolls. Under Zila's direction, Gendo begins construction of Nerve HQ deep beneath modern-day Tokyo, inside the structure of the Black Moon, the one that crashed into a primordial Earth, the same Black Moon that housed the mother of humanity, Lilith. And there, Gendo finds Lilith, and they imprison it in the deepest sanctum they call Terminal Dogma, with the Spear and Longinus they took from Adam in the Antarctic. To protect and hide their new asset, they seal Lilith deep underneath a powerful military base that becomes the foundation for a new city called Tokyo 3. Now, Nerve sells Tokyo 3 to the world as an ark for humanity, as the ultimate guarantee of humanity's survival in this new apocalypse, fittingly nested deep in the egg that humanity hatched from. In the years that follow, Gendo falls in love with a young scientist named Yui Ikari. They marry, and Gendo takes Yui's name as Gendo Ikari. They have a son named Shinji. With the help of Yui, Gendo leads the construction of the prototype Evangelion units. Harvesting parts of Adam from the Second Impact, the Evangelion units bend the power of the godlike being to their own will, pacifying it under layers and layers of human engineering. They hope to use the Evangelion units to combat the incoming angels, and though it's unclear at this point, manipulate the godlike powers that lay dormant in the Evangelion units as a catalyst for human instrumentality when the time comes. However, Gendo commences the construction of a unique Eva unit called Unit 1, and Unit 1 is not harvested from Adam, but from Lilith, who remains imprisoned under Nerve HQ. And it's not made explicit, but it would seem that Zila are not aware of Unit 1's unique origin, marking the first and most important act Gendo makes in carving his own destiny in secret away from his shadowy overlords. Now, Yui volunteers for Unit 1's first pilot test, and Gendo and Shinji are watching from above. Yui is inserted into Unit 1. Tragically, Yui is absorbed by Unit 1, never to return. Now, it's unclear whether Yui intended for this outcome. That's certainly part of the suggestion, though. But what's important is that Gendo is transformed by grief. He vows to manipulate Zila's plans for human instrumentality for the mere purpose of being reunited with Yui. Unable to be an effective father for Shinji, he sends the boy away. During this time, Gendo clones Yui's DNA and begins production of the Rei Ayanami series. Now, if the Eva units represent the peak of humanity's abilities, the Ayanami series represents its limits. Without access to Adam's fruit of life, Gendo can only produce empty vessels, bodies without consciousness, dolls of his childlike wife. To remedy this, he harvests the very soul of Lilith, the very consciousness from which all of humanity descends, and embeds it in the Rei Ayanami doll. It remains ambiguous, but it would seem that Rei doesn't really have any self-awareness of being Lilith, and grows up as a surrogate daughter of Gendo Ikari at Nerve HQ. The story properly begins a few years later when Shinji is 14 and is summoned back by Gendo to report to Nerve HQ. He is commanded to pilot Unit 1 and fight the advancing angels. And this is episodes 1 through 18, which are largely episodic. Every few episodes, Shinji fights a new angel in his Eva. Slowly, Neon Genesis shows its real and ugly face underneath that mecha unassuming fight. And the plot becomes more easy to follow here, so I won't do a laborious recount of everything. Instead, I want to move forward from the initial question of what is happening to the next question of who it is happening to and what does it mean. So let's come to our main character, Shinji Ikari. At the risk of being maybe a bit too reductive, Shinji Ikari is a coward with nihilistic tendencies. Now that's a potent and dangerous cocktail of a human. To make sense of how Shinji comes to suffer this dual-thorn psychosis, we really have to understand how Neon Genesis Evangelion dismantles motherhood and fatherhood, which both become powerful motifs between and across our characters. Neon Genesis has a very dishonest relationship with motherhood. We can begin from the fact that mothers are very obviously absent from the story. Shinji's mother is lost in Unit 1, Asuka's mother commits suicide, Risku's mother commits suicide, all the kids in Shinji's class are without mothers, and on a meta level, the mother of humanity, Lilith, is without any agency, imprisoned under Nerve HQ. However, though that they are fundamentally absent, the ghosts of these mothers, they haunt the story at every stage. Shinji's mother, Yui, and Asuka's mother, they cradle their children from within the Eva units that have absorbed them. The pilot pods are not so subtly built like a womb, and the protective instinct of their mothers saved the children from peril more than once. Now, Ritsuko's mother, Dr. Akagi, she remains in the story through the animus of the Magi computer, whose tripartite programming personifies the three different parts of Dr. Akagi as a woman. And of course, Lilith remains too, her soul touching all of our characters in the form of Rei Ayanami. And so Neon Genesis Evangelion treads this delicate line of contradiction between absent, powerless mothers and present, powerful ones. It's painfully obvious that Evangelion resents its absent mothers. Shinji is so desperate for meaningful relationships with others. He's desperate for love and affection that he was denied by his absent mother. Asuka is so tormented by the suicidal breakdown of her mother, in whose absence she becomes lost in her determination to never need anyone again. And Ritsuko, well, she's determined to become her mother, taking her mother's position at Nerve, going as far as to start a sexual relationship with Gendo, just as her mother had. In the end of Evangelion, Ritsuko's mother, in the form of the Magi system, betrays her when it refuses her self-destruct command, right before Gendo shoots her dead. And most of all, the mother of humanity is literally crucified, hidden in shame from all the world, named after a demonic sex creature. Neon Genesis could not resent its mothers more if it tried. But nonetheless, much like Shinji, Neon Genesis Evangelion betrays itself. Despite how hard it tries, it can't suppress its fundamental love for its mothers. It can't hide its desperate plea to be seen, to be heard by the same mothers it scorns, to be held, to be told that everything will be okay. Ultimately, the salvation of humanity is heralded by the love between Yui and Shinji. Yui becomes deified as an angelic, godlike being, blending imagery of Jesus' crucifixion with imagery of the Virgin Mary. As a giant, Yui holds to her breast all of humanity. But I am getting ahead of myself. We will deal with instrumentality in due course, and oh, will we have much to say. The point here is that Neon Genesis takes all of this pain, all of this unresolved trauma with motherhood, of both its demonization and deification of mothers, and bottles it in the heart of a 14-year-old schoolboy. This is the origin of Shinji's cowardice. Torn between the love and hate for his mother, he's entirely paralyzed, unable to have a will of his own, let alone act one out in the world. It is also the origin of his nihilism. Without love to orient his life around, Shinji doesn't just fail to find meaning, but he's without the very capacities to recognize meaning in the world at all. He begins to abuse relationships that others force on him as a means to fill the pit inside, and he's unable to understand and navigate the space between himself and others. If he wasn't fundamentally a coward, Shinji would kill himself well before instrumentality begins. The show has a similar but less forgiving relationship with fatherhood. In Neon Genesis Evangelion, fatherhood is characterized by heartless ambition and a dangerous hubris. Misato's father, Dr. Katsuragi, is responsible for the experiments that resulted in the second impact. Now, Misato hates him, not just for raping the world with his ambition to create a god in the image of man, but for failing to be a real father and husband. Yet, as we saw with motherhood, Misato can't escape her father, the best parts of whom are personified in her lover, Ryoji Kaji, who, as much as she tries to run away from, she always ends up back in his arms. And then Asuka's father cheats on her mother with her mother's doctor, and is largely responsible for her suicide. His reckless sexual ambitions condemn Asuka to live a life of independence at any cost. Of course, the hatred of fatherhood manifests most strongly in Gendo Akari. Gendo sacrifices a relationship with Shinji in his arrogance to reunite with Yui. Gendo is obsessed, possessed. He is unrelenting ambition personified. But that's not the primary reason Neon Genesis hates Gendo Akari. I do feel this is more deeply explored in the final Rebuild film, but it does ring true throughout the whole story, and that's this. At his worst, Gendo is characterized as a grown-up Shinji. That is to say, take away the childhood innocence that redeems Shinji's nihilistic cowardice, and what remains is the demon of a man that will grow up to become Gendo. Thrice Upon a Time, the final Rebuild film, explores this powerfully as Shinji faces down his father during instrumentality. The two are twins of each other, in twin Eva units. Their combat is undercut by shots of a young Gendo depressed on a train, serving as a mirror for Shinji to recognize the Gendo within himself and overcome his own inadequacies. Their shared inability to navigate the world in an honest and authentic way is made manifest in the Sony Walkman that threads their characters together. The Walkman is a symbol of the heavy baggage that Gendo condemns Shinji to carry when he abandons him to pursue instrumentality. Shinji loves and hates the Walkman. It's his only connection to his father, so he does find comfort in it. But it also represents everything Shinji fears becoming. Gendo is the Vader for Shinji's Luke. He is the path ahead should Shinji fail to confront his own incapacities and indulge corruption. Neon Genesis doesn't just hate Gendo. It takes everything it hates about itself, everything it hates about humanity, and puts it all into one slimy character, and the result is Gendo Akari. And so Neon Genesis hates its mothers and fathers, but it is somewhat aware of its own hypocrisy. Shinji is a conduit for how much the show hates life. Through Shinji, the story indulges its own crippling fear of what it is to be alive in this world, but through Shinji, it also looks for hope. It stumbles and it falls, and it took 3 goes at an ending to get there, but underneath its nihilistic exterior, I do believe that Neon Genesis hides a fragile optimism that realizes itself in the final act of human instrumentality. Chapter 3, After Human Instrumentality. So what is human instrumentality? Human instrumentality is the merging of humanity into a collective consciousness. It is the dissolution of individuality, where the walls that isolate you from others, the same walls that distinguish you from others, these collapse into each other. Zila wants to manipulate the process of instrumentality to produce a god, born from the totality of humanity's consciousness, contained and sustained by the undying Evangelion units. Gendo wants to manipulate instrumentality for his own purposes, to simply dissolve the boundaries between human hearts and be reunited with Yui, who would be freed from the confines of Unit 1. Everything drives to instrumentality. If the prologue is a new Genesis, instrumentality is an apocalyptic revelation and a new Genesis again. So why does this story of self-contempt and hopelessness lead here? The disgust of the human condition is the bedrock of the story, but it is built up and sustained by a fundamental fear of others. Unable to make peace with their own lives, our characters' ability to navigate the lives of others are inhibited. Shinji's default response to other people is to run away. Gendo's is to manipulate them. Oscar's is to ignore them. Misato's is to sexually subjugate them. Risco's is to reduce them to whatever utility they can provide. The boundaries between the self and the other are symbolically represented in the AT fields that give humans their physical form and give angels and Evas their strength. Now, the opening credits tell us what AT stands for. Absolute terror. Shame of oneself leads to fear of others. We learned this very early on with Schopenhauer's parable of the hedgehog's dilemma, of the poor animals doomed to sting each other should they get too close and seek each other's warmth. Neon Genesis Evangelion is paralyzed by its fear of the other, and it is so paralyzed as a result of its own shame of itself. Human instrumentality becomes the perfect solution to this problem, the perfect cure for the problem of existing. Both the hatred of the self and the fear of the other can evaporate if the boundaries of individuality dissolve. The self loses form, and so there's no self to be ashamed of, and the other is absorbed, so there is no other to fear. Human instrumentality is designed to be and sought after by our characters as a paradise to cure the disgusting human condition. Except human instrumentality is not the paradise it seems, but rather it is the logical conclusion of Neon Genesis's nihilistic cowardice. It offers the coward salvation without action. It promises a solution without redemption. It offers the nihilist a path forward without meaning, hope without identity. Neon Genesis knows this. It is inherent in the name of human instrumentality. To instrumentalize is to use, to manipulate, to repurpose, to harness, to reduce to a mere tool. This is not a salvation that elevates humanity, but one that minimizes humanity as a means to an end. This, of course, is to spit in the face of Kantian moral philosophy, which calls us to universally treat the other as an end in themselves, to see other people not through our relationship with them, not by the advantage or disadvantage that they may offer, but as walking infinities of their own, as a destination of our will and not a tool of it. As a matter of definition, instrumentality is the antithesis of this. And Neon Genesis is so arrogantly aware of the philosophical context it tells its story in, which is a whole other video, but the naming of its revelatory climax in such a way positions itself diametrically opposite from the humanist Kantian framework, and positioning itself in such a way it fully embraces the disgust for humanity that sparks and sustains the story. Instrumentality is the ultimate expression of self-pity, realized in the most abrasive possible form. Neon Genesis would command your identity forfeited, such that it doesn't have to feel ashamed of itself. It takes mass suicide to a new level. Not merely does it demand your death, but the manipulation of your very consciousness, of all consciousness, to numb the pain of what it is to be. The story wrestles with itself, though. It so desperately wants to give in to this selfish desire to wrap itself in the blanket of instrumentality. But part of it stubbornly holds out. Part of Shinji resists the temptation, and we can see this in the tension across the three different endings. In the original anime, Shinji is confronted with himself as others see him. That is, himself as an other, as the thing he fears the most. Through the power of instrumentality, he sees himself in the hearts of others, and as the walls of individuality begin to collapse, he is able to bridge the gap between himself and the other. That is, he is able to finally understand other people, to see other people, without reducing them to a shallow means of comfort. Instrumentality allows Shinji to accept his own existence as an individual within the universality of humanity. However, this revelation is undercut by the fact that all of this enlightenment is caused and sustained by instrumentality itself. That is, to accept himself, Shinji had to force other people into a collective consciousness. He had to instrumentalize all of humanity. And while it's unclear, the ending would suggest that instrumentality never is halted, and that Shinji sustains the merging of human consciousness as a means of therapy for himself and others. And so, Neon Genesis Evangelion, the anime, closes out by finding peace and overcoming its disgust for humanity, but at the cost of indulging its temptation to instrumentalize other people. But this is not the end. In the film End of Evangelion, we see another side of instrumentality, which could happen directly after the anime. Shinji instrumentalizes humanity only to the point of discovering the consequences of his temptation. Confronted by the fact that numbing the pain of what it is to be will cost all individuality ever, he wakes up to his own cowardice. And then the deified Yui offers Shinji a choice: wrap humanity in the blanket of instrumentality, or return to individuality. And bravely he accepts individuality. He accepts a life of shame, of fear over the false salvation of instrumentality. And he doesn't know if he will ever be able to overcome his human condition. He doesn't know if he will ever be able to accept himself and live authentically with others. But he is hopeful for the future. And instrumentality concludes with at least Shinji and Asuka return to their individual forms. The two lay beside each other on the shores of the apocalyptic beach. And here Shinji is tested. Beside him lays Asuka, she whom he desperately wants to connect with, but has been terrified of because of his own inability to accept himself. Beside him lays the other, all others personified in Asuka. Will he be able to bridge the gap and see them, to truly see the other, to truly see Asuka without the crutch of instrumentality? No, he strangles her. But Asuka caresses his cheek, for the promise of hope remains as a result of Shinji's brave choice to save individuality. And Shinji cries, ashamed, and Asuka calls him disgusting. As a result of Shinji's choice, the problem of existing remains uncured, and Neon Genesis is just as disgusted with humanity as it was before. But at least it's honest. It's a braver ending, one that doesn't abuse others, one that doesn't hide from the real world. It's admirable. It's real but sad, hopeful but hopeless. But this is not the end. The rebuild films have a wonderful self-awareness about them, what we call in literature self-reflexivity. It's smugly conscious of the fact that this is the third time round. Inherent in the titles, always with 3 numbers, it's particularly potent in the final title, Thrice Upon a Time, for this is indeed the third go at an ending. Self-reflexivity shows its face especially through Kaoru, who's the closest approximation to God in the series, housing the soul of Adam. With all of his self-reflexivity, he's determined to make Shinji happy this time, he says at the end of 2.22. He explicitly admits to meeting Shinji before, and we get that wonderful symbolism of the cyclical circle of his coffins on the moon. And this is part of the reason I keep talking about Neon Genesis Evangelion like it's a person, with emotions, desires, and fears and feelings, because it's quite literally aware of itself. And the self-reflexivity peaks during the final instrumentality of Thrice Upon a Time, where the set and stage of Neon Genesis Evangelion breaks down. The illusion is cast aside, and Neon Genesis doesn't need to pretend anymore. It was never about mecha robots, and as cool as the action was, Neon Genesis isn't scared to admit that it was just cheap and meaningless set design. The climax of instrumentality is not to be battled over by giant robots, but to be meditated on, in the deep consciousness of Shinji and Gendo, materialized in a lonely train carriage. This time, Shinji has not commenced instrumentality out of his own selfish desires. He does so instead to stop his father. Shinji, for the first time, has a will of his own that does not terminate with receiving praise or running away. He's determined to stop his father from making the same mistake he made in the second rebuild film, trying to save Rei during the near third impact and again in the near fourth impact. Shinji just wishes for a world without Evas. That is to say, he wishes to live in the real world. He wishes to look life in the face, to take its hand, and to run into the world of wonder, of pain, the world of learning, mistakes, and hope. As the nightmare of Neon Genesis ends, and as the sun rises on the real world, our characters can now wake as real people of their own on a Tokyo train platform, all now individuals of their own, with hope in their hearts to live without the crippling shame. Shinji, a grown man now, takes Mari's hand, and he says, "Let's go." The world was always all before him, but now Shinji is ready to walk within it, and he cannot miss his way. The anime so subtly cuts away to actual footage of Tokyo, and we know that Neon Genesis Evangelion is finally at peace and is able, at last, to live. And so ends one of the greatest modern stories ever told, who after 35 years in the dark can finally grasp firmly the hope it tried so hard to extinguish, but nonetheless, the hope it always had inside. Now, I could make a whole channel out of Eva, so of course I didn't get to everything in this video. Neon Genesis Evangelion has all the tells of a classic literary text. Crucially, it resists definitive interpretation. It can't really be captured or reduced to analysis. The proof is in the sheer volume of work done on Neon Genesis in the YouTube video essay community. This is still one of the early videos of this channel, and so I've taken a really wide lens, big picture approach to Neon Genesis. If given the opportunity and the video does okay, I might hone in on more precise, narrow analysis in the future videos. There's a whole other video to be made on to explain and explore how Hegelian philosophy and his idea of thesis, antithesis, and synthesis kind of permeates throughout the whole story. And I barely spoke about Rei or Kaoru or Misato or Oscar, but I hope even in sharing this incomplete picture of my relationship with Neon Genesis Evangelion, that I might offer some clarity to this notoriously confusing anime and expose the fragile optimism that shines through it. Though what Neon Genesis is to you is entirely your own. Do with this strange story what you will, and no amount of analysis nor commentary should instrumentalize that for you. As always, my friends, have a very good day.